Good afternoon, everybody. We're so excited to have you here today and so many of you joining us for this Partnering for Success webinar. I'm Klaus von Zastro, a Senior Policy Director here at Education Commission of the States, and I'm very pleased to welcome you today. As with all of our Partnering for Success webinars, this webinar is designed to provide you with opportunities to connect with peers, with researchers, with innovators who are providing solutions to the most pressing education policy issues states are grappling with these days. So it's always our goal in these webinars to leave you with insights, inspiration, and resources that can help you be more effective as you address challenges that you're facing in your own states. Now, today's webinar in particular is going to focus on the Tennessee Investment in Student Achievement Funding Formula, which replaced a systems-based funding mechanism that had been in place for almost 30 years in the state. The new formula aims to make students a priority over systems. It aims to empower parents and to incentivize student success and to ensure that all students, regardless of where they are or what their learning needs are, get what they need. So we have a great lineup of speakers today that includes Brent Easley, Legislative Director for Governor Bill Lee, and Sam Pearcy, Interim Commissioner of the Tennessee Department of Education. And our moderator today for this webinar is going to be Katrina Miller, who directs educational partnerships at SAS. Now, a couple of things before we get started. First of all, we'd like to thank our partners who make events like this one possible. So to all of you, thank you for your continued partnership and support. We look forward to hosting Partnering for Success webinars with you and with state education leaders throughout the year. And just one more thing, a few housekeeping matters before we get started. And first is that we're actually recording this session. And second, if you want to get a better view of your speakers today, or like, see them up close and personal, we suggest that you take a moment to change your view settings in Zoom to speaker view, and you can see the possibility for doing that in your upper right-hand corner. And finally, we strongly encourage you to place any questions that you might have in the chat for the Q&A portion of today's session, which will follow the moderated discussion. So with that, let me hand the baton to Katrina Miller, who'll get our conversation started. Katrina?
Thank you, Klaus, and thank you for having me. As Klaus said, my name is Katrina Miller, and I'm the Director of Educational Partnerships at the SAS Institute. SAS is a worldwide data and analytics company, and we have the privilege and opportunity to partner with Tennessee in providing data and analytics and public transparency around their accountability metrics, their school report card system, as well as this new funding formula, TISA. I also have the added benefit of being a Tennessean, so I get to benefit from the great work that the department is doing and Governor Bill Lee is doing, working on behalf of our students. So I'm really excited to be with Brent and Sam here today to share with you more about TISA and to learn from them in not only getting this sweeping policy change through the legislative process, but also through the policy and rulemaking process, and now into implementation. We'll be starting our first year of allocations this upcoming school year. As Klaus said, previously, Tennessee was under what we called the BEP, the Basic Education Program, which really funded schools and districts based on a basic level of education of keeping schools running. It looked at average daily attendance of students, and then looked at how many teachers that would support how many principals. It even funded, this is how much you get for textbooks based on the number of students you had. It had 46 different categories of funding, really based on the mechanics and operational position of the school and the districts themselves. The new formula, the Tennessee Investment in Student Achievement, is really drastically different in that it looks at a basic level of funding for every student, and then it has 3 additional categories to fund on top of that. So there's a weighted portion based on student characteristics and demographic information, like whether that student has any special needs, an English language learner, perhaps, those types of things. An additional direct funding that the state supports 100%. And then there's outcomes funding that will look at how schools and districts are performing and give additional funding on top of that. In addition to these sweeping changes in policy and practice, the state made an unprecedented investment in our students in our schools by investing a recurring $1 billion additional dollars in the funding formula when they passed this law. So I feel like as a Tennessean, I owe thanks and kudos to the team who led this effort, as my child will benefit and the children that I work with. And I'm so excited to learn more. As Klaus mentioned, we have Brent Easley, who is the legislative director for Governor Bill Lee. And he has led his legislative efforts and manages the office's legislative team, as well as individual legislative staff members for all the executive branch agencies. Prior to this role, Brent worked in the education policy arena as the state director for Students First Tennessee, an ACT organization, considering what he's doing now, as well as the executive director for Tennessee CAN. He has a master's degree from Lipscomb University and lives in Nashville with his wife and 2 children. We also have Sam Pearcy, who's the interim commissioner at the Department of Education. Prior to that role, he served as the deputy commissioner of operations for the Tennessee Department of Education, overseeing divisions supporting finance, information technology, district operations, and performance management. He joined the department in 2013 and helped close out the state's Race to the Top grant. Funny, I left the Tennessee state government in 2013 after helping oversee Race to the Top, and then Sam ushered in. So we briefly passed each other, but I'm excited to have these 2 gentlemen with us to really share more about what's going on in Tennessee and how we're implementing TISA. So we'll start with you, Brent. One of the first priorities of Governor Lee when he took office was really addressing the K-12 funding formula. Can you tell us more about why that was such a priority for him as he took this office in Tennessee?
Absolutely, and thanks for having us. We're excited to talk about this and excited for what this will mean for students in Tennessee. Going back and talking about the funding formula here, it's often litigated, something that there's kind of wide agreement across the state for a long time that there needed to be a change in this formula. And that was something that the governor heard on the campaign trail when he was running for office. He heard it from one end of the state to the other and had kind of marked that as something that he wanted to tackle when he got into office. That momentum, I would call it, for change was something that remained after his first few years in office. And the governor, if you know him, he's not someone that wants to kick the can down the road on a big issue. It's something that he wants to go ahead and dig in on and look for solutions. And so we put together a plan where we would engage stakeholders across the state, move toward a more student-centered funding formula. And I think the plan that we put together, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, yielded a great result. Legislators as a whole wanted to see change here. Administrators wanted to see change. And the governor's interested in continuing investments in education as well. And thinking about the funding formula that we did have and the investments that he wanted to make, it made sense to go ahead and make a change in the funding formula so that we were putting additional dollars into a new, good, well thought out system.
As you mentioned, there were quite a few policy implications, and you did quite a work to gain success with the community and with legislators and other policymakers. Can you tell us more about what those policy implications were and what your team did to ensure success and get the passage of the new funding formula?
Sure. So while we're focusing on student achievement, we have kind of this parallel conversation going on in the state about K through 3 literacy as well. So there are a lot of conversations that were happening at the same time about what can we do to make sure that students have the resources that they need to achieve the goals that they and their families have, and what are the policies that are in place that we have to support those things. So outside of additional dollars going into the system itself, we wanted to think about what do those dollars go toward and how are those dollars generated. So if you take a look at the new funding formula, you'll see, you mentioned the base, the weights, and the direct funding. The weights, for example, go into things like students who are economically disadvantaged and concentrations of poverty, small districts and sparse districts, unique learning needs that students might have. There's several different categories there, 10 different categories or so. And then the direct funding lines kind of highlight things that we are working on as a state: K-3 literacy, fourth grade tutoring, CTE programs that are really important to the governor, charter schools as that sector continues to grow in the state, and funding for students to take the ACT in high school and do a retake of that as well. That's completely funded by the state. As we continue to move forward into implementation, we think that the focus on those individual things will help districts be able to drive student achievement, and the additional investments there will help target those dollars at the places that they really need to go and where student need is most pronounced.
Thank you for that. I think one of the things that I was most excited about were those direct funding opportunities and really doubling down on those areas where we've seen great growth in our state, and knowing too that it's not going to make an increased burden on local governments to come up with those additional match dollars, which I know was huge in ensuring success with getting superintendents associations and those local educational leaders involved and on board with this new funding formula. So thank you for being cognizant of that as you rolled everything out. Sam, we'll go to you now. So you've gone through the law change. It's been approved and implemented, and you've worked on all the business rules, which I know was quite a lift. And now you're rolling it out with the first distributions under the TISA policy in July. What's been the biggest challenge you've overcome, and what are you most proud of in this implementation?
So they're great questions. I'll start with the thing that we're probably most proud of on this, and that is probably how quickly we've seen conversations shifting on the ground. Right. I know I am preaching to the choir on this, but money itself does not change student outcomes. It's how well people are planning with them, how well they are willing to adjust course when they see something not working well, and those types of things. And part of the push behind TISA was ensuring that we were getting more transparent, more digestible information down to the local level and in the hands of stakeholders and families, so that they can be more meaningfully engaged in the conversations around local education budgeting. And so I would say, we are seeing steps in that direction already. We have this transparency now where people can very easily understand, like, this is what my student generates in this funding formula. I can see that math. And districts have that transparency. That also means that local school boards have that transparency, and county commissions and local funding entities have that transparency. So it's already shifting what the conversations look like for the upcoming fiscal year as schools are taking their budgets before those respective local bodies and being able to say, this is what I get money for, this is what I'm doing with it to try to advance outcomes for those kids. I think there is also the piece, because I don't want to shy away from this, like a $1 billion more in state funding flowing out to schools is also increasing that conversation of how are we going to use this to really drive student outcomes further. This is the largest single investment in education in the state's history, right? And trying to figure out how we use that and how schools are talking to their stakeholders about using it becomes extremely important. And then the last thing kind of all tied to that is that we've seen the added benefit of improved data accuracy, right? When it's super clear what the funding formula is based on and how it operates, and we can reflect that back to districts on a much faster basis throughout the school year, we're seeing districts clean data faster, get it back to us, which we know is having these ancillary benefits in the classroom of teachers knowing more accurate, more timely information about their students. So I'm just going to kind of bundle all of that into this big piece of, we're really excited about conversation shifting. We're seeing it happen, and we know we can keep that momentum going moving forward. I think on the challenge side, and we'll call it an opportunity, right? With more autonomy comes more kind of responsibility, right? And so one of the comfort zones I think that a resource-based funding model gives to school districts is they have something to point back at and say, well, I am funded with this ratio of counselors or nurses or any given thing that is or is not in the funding formula. I think when we say, hey, we're going to fund you based on the kids and the needs that we see of them, you have to figure out at the local level how best to serve them. We know that's what good education agencies on the ground are doing, but we do also recognize that there's this kind of growing pain moment of saying, I've got to actually assess these needs, and I have to be transparent about those to my community and why we have this number of this type of staff versus that. But that's what we wanted. That's what we believe Tennesseans should be entitled to, and how they can engage well with their schools. And so I would say kind of that shift in mentality has been probably one of the bigger places where we've seen growth opportunities across the state.
You know, I think a lot of the things that you mentioned are really complementary and couple well together. You talked about shifting the conversation and helping them make decisions, and them needing to make those decisions about what's working and what's not. But in order to do that, you need really good and transparent data and strong data. And so I love that it's not an either or, it's a both and with your agency. You're really focusing on providing all the information in a really fast, timely fashion. For those who don't know it, Tennessee gets out their TCAP scores, which is our statewide summative assessment, in the summer. I think they'll be coming out to the districts this month. So they get those back really fast. I know in some states, they're not getting those out until the fall or even the winter. So you really made that a priority in your state, making information available at every level and making it clean and reliable so that districts can make really good decisions with the funding that you're making available as well. So thanks for bringing that up. Another question for you, Sam, is when you think about the focus on the public transparency and involving the public that the governor's administration did when they were passing the law. They did a lot of focus groups and a lot of public outreach and getting information into what do parents think, what do education leaders think. And you've talked a lot about transparency and implementation. How will you maintain that moving forward? You've talked a little bit about, funding and how it's being allocated, and now it's coming into fruition and there's going to be money spent. What's going to happen next to kind of make transparency around now how it's being spent and kind of our return on investment?
Yeah, those were the key words there, return on investment, right? Through this entire conversation, I think both with the engagement groups that represented a ton of variety and stakeholders, with legislators, with school districts, the question everyone wants to know is what are we getting from this new approach, this new money going in, and what does that mean for our kids? And so, yes, we kind of chatted about how it's a lot easier to understand how the money is coming down, but now we've got to reach this other side of that equation about how is it actually being spent at the local level. And I would say that that comes down to building out really transparent and clean family portals where people can see that information cleanly, whether that's via your state report cards or other approaches to it. But one of the things that we are working on is making sure that we're creating opportunities for alignment, both in how the money is being spent and to initiatives that we know are making changes. So Brent kind of mentioned earlier some of the direct funding areas that are big priority areas for us in Tennessee, the K-3 literacy push, some of our work in CTE. And we want to be able to turn around data on that about putting side by side, here's the money being spent and here are the outcomes being achieved in this area, at this school, and this district across the state, so that we're actually showing to all of our stakeholders how the funding is being translated into outcomes for kids. Now, I will just go ahead and note for people who work with school districts and work in the accounting space, this is a big change moment, right? The tools are there, right? This is cost center accounting, assign it to an initiative. But one of the things that we're trying to focus on from the department lens is making sure that as we kind of make those evolutions in reporting to get to a different grain size, right? That's not just about account codes that align to our state chart of accounts, but actually something meaningful a parent can understand really and help drive a local conversation. Part of what we are attempting to do is making sure that we're integrating well, streamlining opportunities with things like our planning process, right? So when you write into your Title I plan or your state budget plan, what you are doing, you are tagging that initiative with a very specific cost center that then can translate into your funding work and how you're tracking the dollars. So I think for us, we want to be sure that we're creating those streamlines and coherence for districts as we think about building out those reporting structures and kind of where we need to get to. The other piece that I would say on this is that engagement doesn't stop, right? So we still have a TISA steering committee that leans in and helps provide feedback opportunities about how we're thinking about displaying data on this topic or that topic. And that continuous feedback loop becomes really, really important to making sure that the tools we're developing aren't just being pushed out there and never looked at and not serving, the people of Tennessee well. That is not a strong return on investment. And so I think that piece of continued engagement throughout is something that was a foundation of TISA being developed, being passed, and is going to continue through implementation and reporting moving forward as well.
Thank you for that. So we have some time for questions, and we have a lot coming in, so I'm excited to get to some of them. And you've touched on a lot of these themes, but I think people are just wanting more. I know it's a hot topic, funding formulas. A lot of states are addressing the changes, and implementation is not easy. So learning from the successes and, as you said, the opportunities for improvement, Sam, I think others will want to learn from you. So I'll start with I like this one because it kind of riffs off what you were just talking about, Sam. What support is the state providing to districts and school leaders to adjust to a new and more flexible way of thinking about budgeting?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And so what I would say here is that this is a learning curve for everyone involved, right? We do know the things that work. And I think Brent mentioned this earlier, right? The state also passed a law about 3 years ago focused on early literacy efforts and what change in instruction needed to look like, and the types of high quality instructional materials we needed to bring to bear on classrooms, how we need to support teachers through ongoing coaching and networking. And so I think there are some of these initiatives where there is strong state direction and support mechanisms for what it's going to look like to do this work stronger and better moving forward. And we are seeing great uptake from districts. Let me just shout them out. They are hungry and eager to partner with one another and to partner with the state to do what is best for kids. There are going to be other areas that is going to be this ongoing learning cycle, being able to understand exactly how economies of scale plug into this work, and how do you talk about local budgeting to stakeholders when you've got to explain, right? Transportation needs to serve students across the district, and so this slice has to kind of operate in that way. And so I think there's going to be this ongoing piece that we are going to have to keep engaging with districts in that ongoing feedback loop to think about how does that actually look. The moment right now, though, is really that pause about the true needs assessment, right? When I mentioned that growth opportunity challenge area early on about releasing from the mindset that a ratio is the end all be all, right? Many folks on this call will know research often can produce to say, well, this is the best practice ratio. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? As a piece of information to bring to bear. But if you're not doing anything to sync that up to your local context and needs, then you've stopped kind of short of completing the puzzle. And I think that is an area we're trying to push ourselves as a state and support districts in to really grow into that space to kind of assess how do we actually get a good read on what it looks like to build this. And I, for those of you who are less familiar with Tennessee, it is extremely diverse, right? We have, and I know many of you do, very large urban areas that are all very different in their demographic makeup. We have very, very rural, very small, whole 9 yards. So I think there is a piece to this that there is not going to be a one size fits all. And so being sure that we're actually supporting the local engagement work rather than a solution to the budgeting thing becomes an important part of that conversation as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. There are a lot of supports. I've seen that firsthand, and lots of outreach to districts, from everything from IT and accounting structures, like you mentioned, all the way to the really thinking about the education policy and programs and implementation structures. I think this one's for you, Brent. Sam, I think you can add into, but what strategies did you use in your advocacy to make this change to a student-centered funding system, appealing to all stakeholders across political parties, et cetera?
Yeah, I think there's pretty wide consensus that we can do better in investing in students across the state. And we set up a framework, and a lot of this is archived and online, and I can, if anyone reaches out after this, I can send a link over to where that stuff lives. But we created a timeline and a process to be able to go out and proactively engage stakeholders across the state. We did subcommittees on a variety of different topics. We had a steering committee that helped kind of oversee that work. We had public feedback sessions. We had places where the public could submit comments on the funding formula through a digital method as well. And we had thousands of comments there, lots of people engaged in the process, and it really yielded a good result. And the final product of the funding formula itself was changed and tweaked based on the feedback that we got from those stakeholders. And so we think that it made a better end product because we were intentional about how we engaged folks. It was a shorter timeline on than I think some thought that we would execute that feedback strategy on. And we did that with a purpose, and we wanted to be efficient and effective at engaging folks ahead of the legislative session with a goal in mind of being able to do better for students. And the process really worked. And we're thankful to all the people that played a part in that, whether they were a legislator or an advocacy group or members of the public, members of school districts, parents, even students. And that was really just an amazing opportunity and a great system that really brought us some critical information.
Sam, do you want to add anything to that, or does that represent?
I think that was solid. I would just echo Brent's statement there about sort of the intentionality on the timeline. I think there was concern about it on the front end, but the level of engagement that was happening, the depth and meaningful engagement that was happening around that. I think a lot of people try to tackle funding formulas and it drags out to a multi-year thing to the point where every little tiny tidbit has been nitpicked and pivoted in all the different components. And so I would just echo that that intentionality around the timeline coupled with the engagement led to a successful and well-accepted end result.
Yeah, there are a few questions that have come up about how parents are involved or advocacy organizations, districts, and I think both of you kind of highlighted on that. Not only was the law really looked at from all those feedback groups, but all of the policies as well. The department and the administration published all the policies and asked for feedback on those as well. So it wasn't, separate. It was the feedback structure was maintained throughout and continues, like you mentioned earlier, Sam, with the steering committee. So now you're in the implementation. A question came up. You mentioned the importance of local stakeholder transparency. How is Tennessee publishing and helping stakeholders understand funding data?
I'll take that one. So we are working on some modules to help kind of walk through clean-cut, simple explanations of how the funding formula operates. As part of the law, we will also release a TISA guide on July 1 that provides kind of a walkthrough of a more detailed, not just what this is, but also how it operates and kind of what that means districts are doing from a data lens to plug into it.
So there's a coup here, so I want to give you that. 3 clicks got me to your TISA calculator. Amazingly straightforward. I see 4 adjustments you've not mentioned, but are ones that are being discussed in Montana. Can you speak to adjustments for small, sparse, fast growing, and salary equity?
Oh, good questions. Okay, yeah. So I think I heard small, sparse, fast growth, and salary equity. Is that right? Okay. So small and sparse was a fascinating conversation during the development of TISA, right? I think we've got a number of districts who have less than 1,000 kids in them. And then we have a number of districts who are in counties that are just extremely spread out. And that became a big question and a big push during the engagement groups where people were talking about the challenges of either economies of scale or transportation, components like that. And I think that's where we saw those components come into play, right? So those were both added in. We sort of started with the thresholds that were found in some versions of federal guidance around what constitute a small district or a sparse district, and then built that out with the engagement groups respectively. I will say there were all sorts of questions that came up during that engagement process, like, does the county square mileage that we're using to determine sparse include lakes and rivers, right? I mean, there are all sorts of things that have bubbled up along the way. And I think Brent mentioned this well earlier too. There were tweaks associated with all that feedback and or just responses needed to recognize them. And that is part of how our public comment period operates. We owe responses back that get published publicly on every question that is posed. So to Katrina's point about that rulemaking and the policies that went along with TISA being public, all of that is out there as well. Fast growth, I know states have very different ways about how they approach this. TISA, like our former funding model, is all based on 1 year lag data. And I think, we can talk through if people have questions on it, but the challenges that happen with trying to do funding formulas on current year data. So we stuck with lag year data, but the law did also include an explanation of how fast growth funding would work. We increased the size of that pool of funds available to districts. And so it looks at essentially what is the change in student enrollment in the current year compared to how they are funded. One of the unique things that I think we saw Tennessee take on was a specific slice of that fast growth pot of money going targeted to infrastructure stipends. So not just where we saw a 1 year growth change, but in districts experiencing 3 years of consistently high growth, how can we give them an additional funding to recognize the fact that they might be tackling higher infrastructure challenges than a single year difference. And then we have a version of salary equity that is outside of the funding formula. It was set up in a separate law, so it is in Tennessee handled distinct and apart from our funding formula. There is a piece of that, happy to give more information to whoever posed that question, but it does live outside of our TISA funding formula.
So there are a couple of questions that are similar. I'm going to combine them. Are any districts' local funding obligations increasing under TISA? If so, how did you approach pushback from these districts? And then there's a flip question of, did anyone receive less state funding under TISA, and how did you message that? So kind of the same coin, different sides.
Yeah, let me, I'll start there and then kick it over to Sam. As we talked with the governor about making this change, inevitably when you move to a funding formula without an injection of additional funding, when you change the formula, you end up creating winners and losers. And that was not something that we wanted to do. And the governor wanted us to be thoughtful about that, but he also wanted us to be thoughtful about how we impacted the local obligation as well. We didn't want to set up a scenario where we would be increasing funding by a massive amount and then causing the local obligation to go up to a place that was unattainable or would cause a local tax increase. And so we had that frame in mind as we worked with stakeholders and worked internally to set up the new funding formula and also put that additional $1 billion in there. And so I'll let Sam talk a little bit about what that impact has looked like on districts.
And I will say this, that that was a priority. We heard from Brent and the governor early on about making sure that we were keeping our eye on the local fiscal impact the whole way through. And so that was an important piece of the puzzle as we were working with stakeholders to design the formula. In terms of overall impact and how that played out, essentially the most districts across the state, I mean, all but a small handful, actually saw a decrease in their local required funding. And so that question we spent more time dealing with is, how does that intersect with a separate state law that addresses maintenance of effort of education funding at the local level? But essentially it meant that localities could keep their funding level, and the funding formula change itself was not the thing driving up local costs. And so as long as we kept people under their maintenance of effort levels, which was true across the board, we didn't run into that issue. I think what we did look for, though, is sort of these safety net provisions to help address districts who came in receiving less under the new funding formula. I want to be really, really clear, though, that is such a small group, and you had to be a very small district with a very homogeneous population, and you had to really be having a pretty severe loss of student enrollment. So these were districts who, under the prior funding formula and sort of all the murkiness in the black box of that, were being floated at a very high funding level relative to the students being served when you compare that statewide. But the legislature did add in and had this an accounting piece for that allowed for a hold harmless provision to step those districts down over a 4-year period into what would be their TISA allocations. So again, that is maybe 6 of our 147 districts statewide who fall into that category. And so very, very limited impact in that space. And again, it was also addressed in legislation, which I think kind of helped people understand what the situation was on the ground in those areas.
So a follow-up question to that we've gotten a few times is about that $1 billion investment. Where did that come from? How is it being funded? And are you raising funds for that? Kind of what was the source of that funding?
Yeah, great question. We are very fortunate as a state to have an economy that's in a great position right now. We've had over collections of state revenue for the past several years, and we've tried to make smart investments with those additional tax dollars that have come in. So the bulk of those have gone into, there are really 2 big buckets of places where we've put that additional revenue, and that's education and infrastructure.
Thank you for that. So there are a couple of questions around the weights and funding equity. So just kind of summing this up, what did you use to determine the base and the weights, what evidence? And then also, what types of supporting analysis were performed to inform the magnitudes of the various funding adjustments to provide true funding equity for different types of students in different locational education settings?
I'll tackle that one. So we looked a lot about what everyone else was doing in the country. I will say that, right? It's useful, but the piece that I will kind of draw a distinction on is there are student-based formulas out there that emphasize heavier on the base and smaller proportions on the weights. And there are states out there who do the exact opposite. And so that is going to be like a decision each state would have to tackle as they kind of approach that. And that's a prioritization thing. I think for us in Tennessee, we looked at what other states in the region, other states nationally were doing, but we also looked at how this impact would play out, right? So it was important for us to be able to say, hey, here was what the funding formula was doing historically, and to what specific subgroups of students theoretically the BEP was being directed, and those different elements, and sort of be able to say, we want all that to look better, right? We want our investments in economically disadvantaged students to be stronger. We want our investment in CTE to be stronger. We want our investments in ensuring every kid has an ACT retake opportunity fully covered, right? All of these different pieces of the puzzle were what we looked at to be able to say, how can we plug this in and make it work well? I think when you kind of think about some of the weights and seeing what makes sense relative to one another, that's where we relied heavily on our engagement groups, right? We can run the numbers on the back end all day long, but we had the groups who helped provide input on that and helped kind of direct that. And that's really where some of that differentiation came in. But for us, we also wanted to be able to do that analysis to say, are economically disadvantaged kids in the state better off under TISA than they were under the BEP? our special education students better off under TISA than they were under the BEP, and kind of be able to ensure that we were benefiting students across the state.
And I will give a shout out to the TISA calculator and all the resources that are already available online. A lot of that has all of what those weights are and the information around those. So I encourage you, if you have specific questions about that, to look into those resources, because they are vast and very detailed. So I'm going to switch over to the direct funding. There's a question about the direct funding. How many programs, interventions receive direct funding, and does the amount of funding go up depending on how many students participate? Are there participation caps, or is the idea to incentivize the program's interventions by providing more funding for more participation?
So everything about TISA is student-based. So the more participation in it, the more funding is generated. And I think the direct funding line specifically, Brent mentioned this earlier, it was about incentivizing performance in key important areas to the state. And so that is how that was intentionally laid out, to both encourage participation and encourage supports for students to achieve outcomes related to those direct funding lines.
I would add to, with those direct funding lines, the flexibility is built in there too for districts to really build the program that fits with their district and for their students. So CTE, for example, it is not prescriptive to districts on you have to have this one CTE program to be able to qualify for the funding. And so that maintaining that flexibility for districts to innovate and do what's right for their students is it was important to us.
So now we'll go to the outcomes. So we talked about base, weights, and direct funding. What metrics are being used to determine outcomes in funding in TISA? Is this allotted by system, school, or by specific student?
Still student, right? Again, we are holding strong to that. We have an outcomes committee. So again, engagement, just theme of the day. There's an outcomes committee, and it is actually named specifically in law that it will exist and help set the metrics for what the outcomes will look like. So that committee helps set essentially metrics at the elementary, middle, and high school level associated with key indicators for those spaces. So we've got third grade literacy in the elementary bands. We've got some 8th grade TCAP or state test performance in the middle school bands, and then some more focus on ready graduate indicators like both kind of ACT performance, industry credential achievement, attainment, things like that in the high school space.
All right. Thank you both. I think we got to a lot of the questions. Hopefully some of the themes that emerged for the audience, that emerged for me, is one, stakeholder engagement is critical. Providing transparency and getting feedback from everyone that's going to be impacted by this, which is every citizen in our state, was crucial to both the governor's office and the department as they passed the law and now are implementing this historic funding formula in Tennessee. And then the second thing that really emerged with me was keeping students the focus in the center, regardless of what you're measuring, how you're measuring it. We really want to look at individual student performance and making sure that we're addressing the needs of every student in our state. So, gentlemen, thank you for the great work that you're doing in our state and for also sharing with our ECS audience. We really appreciate it. As mentioned, there are a lot of resources online around TISA. We'll follow up with a few resources on this webinar. And then, as always, feel free to contact any of us if you have any questions. SAS is honored to be a partner with Tennessee in this work and looks forward to continuing providing a lot of transparent information to the public, not only in our state, but across the nation as we all grapple with funding formula and improve each other by working through this with students at our focus. Thank you. Klaus?
Well, thanks so much, Katrina, for that very, very skillful moderation and for addressing and handling all of those questions. And obviously, we have huge thanks to Brent and Sam for all of your insight. I mean, this was really a privilege for us to be able to feature each of you today. There's so many eyes on Tennessee right now with TISA, and it's so great to hear about how this came about and all the work that you're doing right now to ensure that you understand the outcomes of this really innovative strategy. But I also really want to thank all of you in the audience today, because I mean, I go to a fair number of webinars, and I have to say, seldom do we have that many excellent, detailed, and very, very interesting questions. And so it was really helpful to be able to see all of those today. So we're very grateful to all of you for joining us today. Now, remember that in addition to all of those resources that Katrina just mentioned, you can also use Education Commission of the States as a resource. We're here to support you in our work. So now we hope that as we end this webinar, you're taking away at least one idea from this session that can support you in really the important work that you're doing in your state. Now, if you have any other questions or requests related to today's session, please also feel free to reach out to Chris Duncombe, a senior policy analyst here at ECS. I mean, he is steeped in these issues and is an excellent resource for this kind of work. Just a reminder that today's recorded session will be shared in your post-event email, so you can revisit it if you want to. Now, finally, just want to remind you that you should stay tuned for new Partnering for Success webinars, and we'll be announcing those in the coming weeks and months. But most of all, we just want to thank you for your time today and are so pleased you could join us. Thanks again.